Okay, well, I'd like to thank you very much for the welcome. It's lovely to be here. I know one or two people associated with the Society over a number of years, and I've never yet been to this place, though, which is a new initiative as a building, and I hope it gives a good impetus to the work that the Society's been involved in, the important work it's been involved in over a number of years. So I'm grateful to have the chance to share with you tonight. I've got a little bit of technology here that is hypersensitive to touch. So if it speeds beyond the slides where I want it to be, I'll have to slow it down. But hopefully I will manage to coordinate my eye, brain, hand and that machine in one movement. There are some important things about this title before we get into the thing as a whole. These four principles that I want to look at did have Christian origins. They were developed by a group of Christians against a Christian background, and I'm going to try and explain something of that too, so you can see and understand where they come from. But the second part of this, wider ownership, is as important in my view, but so also is the question mark. And that's where your discussion will come into play. So I hope tonight will be in two parts. One is some background that I will open up for you and some questions that I'll pose about the potential value or otherwise of these principles today. But I'm not presupposing an answer to that. There is a question mark there, and it's not just an adornment or an accident, it's a real question mark, and you need to supply the answer, or the answers. So we'll see where we go to. So I'm grateful for the invitation to speak at this seminar, and on this occasion to try to do so precisely about the concept and practice of dialogue, which is of course itself embodied in the name of this society, of which I'm pleased to be associated as a member of its board of advisors. Now, for much of my professional work in academic life, I've been engaged as Professor of Interreligious Relations in the non-confessional study of religion, i.e. standing outside of religions and trying to understand and explain them. Particularly my areas of specialism in the relationships between religion, state and society. But before I became involved in academic posts, I was working as an ordained Christian minister of religion in the Baptist tradition of Christianity. And in that capacity I was already engaged in interreligious dialogue, not only looking at it, so to speak, from the outside, but being engaged in it as myself a religious believer. During the 1980s, I worked as community relations officer for the Greater Manchester Council of Churches, with a special brief for working on issues of interfaith relations and also issues of racial justice. And personally, in my life, I can trace back my early awarenesses of what it means to engage in interfaith dialogue to the family of my best friend at school. My best friend at school was from an Orthodox Jewish background. His parents suffered greatly in Poland at the time of the Second World War. And even from back in those days, I can remember two questions that my school friend's mother asked me as a young Christian, and a Christian in a quite strongly evangelical Christian tradition. And she said, "Why do the Christians bully?" And then she used the name of my friend. Why do the Christians bully him at school? Because he's different. Why do they do that, the Christians? That made me feel very uncomfortable because, I wasn't quite sure that believing Christians would be bullying him. But then perhaps maybe it's not as simple as saying, well, maybe there are some kinds of good Christians and some kinds of not so good Christians, and how is it that the Jewish community has experienced Christians over the centuries, and what did it mean in that school? And she also asked me the question, why do you Christians call our scriptures old? Because Christians, when they refer to the Hebrew scriptures, call them the Old Testament. And sometimes old sounds as if, well, in some value systems, it sounds as if, well, it's old and back there somewhere, and we're now with the new. And in her mind, at least, the fact that Christians called their sacred scriptures, perceived as the word of God to them, living and addressing them as old, what were we saying? Were we saying that what had come along in terms of the revelation of Christianity was new? Yes. But were we also saying by new, better? Were we saying that it meant that that which was old no longer mattered in any sense? Now, those were just two questions that an ordinary Jewish mother in an Orthodox Jewish tradition, in an ordinary conversation in a house, asked me as a young teenage Christian. I couldn't really get to grips with them, but they've stayed with me ever since, and in some ways have shaped many of my understandings about what's involved in interreligious dialogue. Because the first question, why do the Christians bully Leslie, reminds me, and has always reminded me, of the importance of taking account of, in a sense, power relationships and discrimination and their effects upon inter-religious relations and interfaith dialogue. We can, at an individual level, sit down together in a room and achieve a certain level of mutual understanding. But there is a wider world around it, and that wider world has a whole load of history, has a whole load of social, economic, political context, and one can't shut it all out. It comes into the individual relationship, shapes and forms the history. And that's always stayed with me. Just as that second question that she asked, why do you Christians call our scriptures old, was a challenge to my religious understanding, my theological framework, my way of framing the world in religious terms, and made me think about that and the implications of how I was framing things and the language that I was using when heard by people from outside my religious tradition. So, that's a little bit about me biographically, but might help to explain some things that I will open up for discussion as we go on. Because often, when speaking professionally at seminars and conferences, while I always acknowledge my own religious tradition and commitment, I'm usually addressing them from a non-confessional and more observational stance, outside, looking in, speaking about. But on this occasion, having been invited by a society that does have a social commitment but doesn't hide its religious identity and commitment, as one who myself personally seeks to follow Jesus, Isa of Nazareth, I try to do that in my life in an inclusive Christian way. Personally, as said in the introduction, formed by the Baptist tradition of Christianity, but also through marriage and family connected to the Roman Catholic tradition. And so, as I open up these four principles, I'll be drawing on some things that have involved my own personal biography. And it goes back, really, these four principles, to a period when I was involved in the work of the so-called Committee for Relations with People of Other Faiths, of the then Christian umbrella body in Britain, the British Council of Churches, and that was a period between 1982 and 1992. And more specifically, I'll be introducing these four principles of dialogue. I'll trace their background, their development and their use, and a quarter of a century on, as I say, be inviting you to explore this question mark about how appropriate or useful these might still be, and also for people other than Christians. So, what are these four principles of dialogue then, as first articulated by the British Council of Churches? And they came out first in a little booklet and originally published in 1981. This is the slightly revised 1983 edition, Relations with People of Other Faiths, Guidelines for Dialogue in Britain. In those days, price 60p, it would probably be over £1 now. But the 4 principles that are set out there are as follows, and now we'll see gradually if the technical works. Yes. Dialogue begins when people meet each other. Oops, it's very sensitive. This dialogue depends upon mutual understanding and mutual trust. Dialogue makes it possible to share in service to the community. And finally, dialogue becomes the medium of authentic witness. Now, there's something you might notice about that 4 principles straight away. 1 or 2 things, maybe. First of all, there isn't necessarily anything religious, actually, in the language of those principles. Maybe the word witness sounds a little religious, but much of the rest isn't particularly religious. It also doesn't sound especially Christian, although again the word witness might have a Christian flavour, although it appears in other religions in the English language. But those 4 principles in many ways have informed and guided the work that's been done by the Christian churches over the last 20 to 25 years in trying to engage with people of other faiths in the UK. But it's important to understand that although these principles were articulated in the UK, where they actually came from, because they came from a wider Christian international and global context before they were taken up and developed in the UK. So in many ways, the origins of these 4 principles can be found in that wider global Christian community, and that's not an accident, because during the 1960s and 1970s, an increasing consciousness emerged of a shift in the centre of Christian presence and activity from Europe and North America to the countries of what I prefer to call the 2/3 world. In some settings, notably in Latin America and in Africa, that was a majority Christian presence. In other contexts, in particular in Asia, it was a minority Christian presence, and one in a setting of other ancient cultures and religions, but also at a time in the 1970s and 80s where there were rising national movements. And especially in the context of decolonisation and nation building, minority Christian groups in different parts of the world were faced with the question of how they could both maintain their integrity as Christians, including their links with the global Christian community of which they were a part, and not excluding those from the world of the former coloniser. But at the same time, how could they be seen as being fundamentally a part of the emerging societies into independence of where they were born and where they lived? How could they be seen as not alien to those re-emergent national identities of their countries of origin? How could they be both Christians of integrity and fully be seen as and accepted as belonging within their national and ethnic identity? And this was a very big set of issues in the global Christian community in the 2/3 world in the 1970s. And therefore it was the minority Christian churches of Asia that first pushed this agenda of inter-religious dialogue within the global Christian community, and against the background of that kind of national emergence, independence movement, and so on. And one of the key international consultations that took place in that regard happened in Chiang Mai in 1977. Now that location of that was in Thailand predominantly, Buddhist country with a small Christian minority. The theme of that consultation was dialogue in community, and it led to a publication in 1977 entitled Faith in the Midst of Faiths, Reflections on Dialogue in Community. So very much a lot of the thinking that lay behind what eventually became these 4 principles of dialogue used an educative resource among Christians in the UK came out of the experience of minority Christian groups in the two-thirds world. And against that background, in January of 1980, the so-called then Central Committee of the World Council of Churches commended a set of 13 specific guidelines on dialogue with people of living faiths and ideologies. Another little booklet that came out in 1979 on my collections. This one was 65p. Now, interestingly, notice something, and this resonates with Ozcan's introduction. This came out in 79, when also there were large parts of the Christian community that lived in countries with communist rule and Marxist ideology as the predominant power system. So it speaks about guidelines on dialogue with people of living faiths, because it was thinking about Christian dialogue with Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jews, but also living faiths and ideologies, because for many Christians the ideological dialogue was as important and challenging. How could you, as a Christian, live in a society predominantly governed by Marxist ideals? And Christian Marxist dialogue emerged in that context, both in parts of Europe under certain conditions, but also in Latin and Central America. So, those guidelines on dialogue, 13 of them, first emerged in 1979, 1980, for use among the member churches of the World Council of Churches worldwide. That's a large number of Protestant Christian churches and Orthodox Christian churches. The Roman Catholic Church is not part of that directly. And the work towards those guidelines was prepared by what was called the subunit on dialogue with people of living faiths and ideologies, and it later became known as the dialogue subunit in the World Council of Churches. And the World Council of Churches, when they produced these, said, okay, we refer these now to our member churches throughout the world. Please study them, please think about them, please reflect on them, and please see if you can maybe use them in your specific context. Perhaps you need to adapt them, and please do some work on this. So that task was in a sense set from these global guidelines on dialogue, and out of it came the 4 principles of dialogue. But in the 1970s in the UK, most of British society probably had relatively little appreciation of the religious dimensions of the new plurality that was part of our life in Britain. Politicians certainly, and also many people in wider public life, saw the new diversity primarily in terms of ethnicity or race, and not in terms of the religious diversity that was brought about by significant migrations of people from the 50s, 60s and 70s. Very early on though, some key people in the Christian community did identify the importance of faith. For example, Bishop John Taylor, as long ago as 1977, said this. He said, "The existence of religious minorities presents us with both problems and opportunities which are distinct from those that arise in the presence of racial and cultural minorities. And these issues should not be lost sight of or evaded." So he was pointing at an early stage when there wasn't much awareness certainly government wasn't talking about the importance of faith in social life, about the importance of that. And in that, Bishop Taylor wasn't kind of on his own, because from as early as April 1977, the Assembly of the then British Council of Churches, the kind of umbrella body for the British churches, declared this. They said the presence in Britain of significant numbers of people of faiths other than Christian very sensitive, this one. The presence in Britain of a significant number of people of faith other than Christian is within God's gracious purposes. Now, that was a very significant statement from the Christian church body at that time. It was saying it wasn't accidental, in a sense, people's religious identity. And it was, in a way, a positive evaluation of that. Now, this was coming from within a majority faith community who could well have said, well, actually, it's a bit threatening to have people of other faiths present. Or they could have said, well, it doesn't really matter, or it's just there. But they said very positively, and they said this for several years running, they repeated this motion in their assembly. The presence of significant numbers of people of other faiths other than Christian is within God's gracious purposes. In other words, they were saying there is something also to say to us as Christians by the presence of people of other faiths. Are we ready to listen to it? It's within God's gracious purposes. We may find some things difficult or challenging, but that's the primary framework within which we should be looking at things. So, all of these things are part of the background to these four principles. And very interestingly, some of the key people who were involved in framing that resolution, and Bishop Taylor, whom I mentioned earlier, and some of the key people who ended up writing these four principles of dialogue, originally had a role as Christian missionaries. Now, from a superficial view of missionaries, that might seem rather paradoxical. But perhaps in many ways it's not so surprising, because missionaries, of course, however they're understood, are very well aware of the human realities of people of other faiths and beliefs, in contrast to those who'd only read about people of other faiths or read about beliefs in books. And actually, Christian missionaries played a very important role in the 1970s and 80s. People like, who eventually became key people, for example, in the world of Christian-Muslim relations, like Kenneth Cragg, Bishop Kenneth Cragg, wonderful book Sandals at the Mosque, and other publications. But many of these people had originally had that role as missionaries. And so it may seem paradoxical, but we'll come back to it later. So out of all of that background came, in 1980, an assembly of the British Council of Churches that welcomed these World Council of Churches guidelines on dialogue, and then were given the task of developing something for use specifically in Britain. Now, the task of developing something was given to a committee. Well, how bureaucratic. And rather strange, the committee was called the Committee for Relations with People of Other Faiths. So it wasn't a committee for Christian thinking about what other people believe or about beliefs of other religions. The words were very definite and very deliberately chosen. A committee for relations. In other words, right from the beginning, it wasn't the abstract set of things about what people might believe or not believe that was put at the centre of that work, but it was, you need to develop a relationship with people. So the Committee for Relations with People, other words, it was very much centred on those who believe and how they shape and form belief in their life and practice it, not just about what they believe. A committee for relations with people of other faiths. And that name, to say, is no accident whatsoever. And from that came this little booklet, Relations with People of Other Faiths, Guidelines for Dialogue in Britain. And when those guidelines came out, there was then a whole process in the Christian churches in this country of, again, will you please take these? Will you look at them? Will you study them in your church groups, in your congregations, in your Bible study groups, in your societies? Will you work out whether these, have the ring of truth about them, have an authenticity about them? Will you try and put them into practice? Are there things about them that you don't think are right? So, just as it began at a global Christian level and then came into the national Christian community, so also then there was an attempt to widen that discussion out nationally. I've gone backwards again, not doing very well with this. So what can we say again about these 4 principles? And in showing them, I'm also showing them now in relation to things that were said in the wider World Council of Churches principles beforehand. Dialogue begins when people meet each other. And that picks up on something that was said in the World Council of Churches guidelines. Dialogue should proceed in terms of people of other faiths and ideologies, rather than of theoretical impersonal systems. It's not religious belief systems that meet. It's people who hold and live by them who meet. And that's where one should start. That's the principle being articulated here. Secondly, dialogue depends upon mutual understanding and mutual trust. And the particular section of the World Council of Churches guidelines that said dialogue can be recognised as a welcome way of obedience to the commandment of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, held in common by Jews and Christians. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. How easy it is to construct the other in ways that are not true to how they are. I, as a Christian, can construct my image of a Muslim, or anyone as a Muslim can construct their image of what a Christian is, rather than through the way of dialogue, where you try to develop mutual understanding and mutual trust. Guideline 3, dialogue makes it possible to share in service to the community. The relevant section of the World Council of Churches guidelines there, something dialogue, it said, is a joyful affirmation of life against chaos, of participation with all who are allies of life, in seeking the provisional goals of a better human community. There may be differences in understanding about what people of different faiths and different traditions are ultimately aiming for, but there can be shared goals of a human community. And dialogue makes it possible to share in that service to the community. And dialogue becomes the medium of authentic witness. And here the relevant section of the World Council of Churches guidelines says, as Christians enter dialogue with their commitment to Jesus Christ, time and time again, the relationship of dialogue gives opportunity for authentic witness. In other words, not shouting at each other across a big divide, but because of a relationship of dialogue, really being able to explain, as the Christian scriptures say, the reason for the hope that is within us, and to expect that that will be done by one's partner in dialogue. And that is a form of witness which is authentic, not a form that's manipulative or a form that's threatening to a person of another faith, but is rooted in a sharing that allows the authenticity, the integrity of my faith and the integrity of yours to come together. So, if I can skip backwards rapidly, as it's going wrong, just back to the four statements there. More luck. This emphasis on people at the centre is the key thing. It isn't, of course, that other dimensions don't matter. Remember when I started to speak and I told you about the questions with my Jewish friend's mother and so on, that I couldn't just go in a world in a little room on my own with myself and her. There was a history that came in that room with me, whether I wanted it there or not. But, nevertheless, still important to begin where people meet each other. There's a lot more to be explored, and some of it has to be, and some of it's very difficult to get into. But you're not likely to get there if you don't begin by meeting. Dialogue depends upon mutual understanding and mutual trust. You could perhaps put that the other way around. And here's a critical question for one of these principles. Is it that way round? Does mutual understanding and mutual trust come because of dialogue? Or do you have to have had some measure, at least, of trust and some measure of understanding to even start to think about dialogue? I mean, if you think somebody else is out to get you, are you likely to even start dialogue with them? So perhaps some minimal mutual understanding and mutual trust is necessary before you can then develop dialogue, which really develops a deeper mutual understanding and trust, which comes first, which is chicken, which is egg, so to speak. Dialogue makes it possible to share in service to the community. Again, there are some people who perhaps have said, well, is that upside down? Is it dialogue that makes it possible then to do joint projects? Do you have to sit down, if you like, and talk with each other and plan together, and then you do a project? Or is it actually, or can it be the other way around? That by sharing in a project of a provisional goal kind of project, not an ultimate goal for eternity, but a provisional goal here and now, how we can make things better in the neighbourhood in which we live. And out of that, we might discover that we start to dialogue with one another about what it is that motivates us to do that. So maybe you can look at it both ways round. Is it dialogue makes it possible to share in service with the community, or is it that sharing in service to the community makes it possible to dialogue? Or perhaps a bit of both. Dialogue becomes the medium of authentic witness. Now, of course, this touches on a very difficult and very sensitive area in relations between people of different faith traditions. How is it possible to be with integrity who I am, and to allow you to be with integrity who you are, to affirm your freedom to be that, and to affirm my freedom to be this, and at the same time, if one is within a faith tradition that makes a claim about truth, and not just truth for me as an individual, but a universal truth, and I think certainly Christianity and Islam make such a claim. How can you make such a claim? What's the implications of making such a claim? Because that claim probably has a challenge for the other person. Because if you're saying that my faith has a universal claim and significance, is it questioning the other person? And what's the implication of that? And how can this tension be held together between affirming my faith, my identity, my freedom and space to be, to practice who I am and yours to be in practice who you are, but also to speak freely about what it is that we believe our traditions say, not just to us, but to the world. Indeed, not just to the world, but possibly to the whole cosmos. Is it possible to have dialogue is, in that sense, a medium of authentic witness, not to do with manipulating people? And what happens if in that it is the case that some people adopt a religion that was not the religion of their origin, their family, their culture, their individual history? Very sensitive, very difficult, and we know that in relations between different religions, either violence at the point of the sword has forced conversions, or manipulations through economic and other psychological pressures and means have been used. That isn't authentic witness. Is there room for authentic witness and the possible choice of people who follow a pathway that they were not originally following, who find in that pathway a vision of truth that transforms their life, that perhaps for whatever reason they didn't find in their original faith, tradition or community, perhaps because of their experience within it, maybe because some of the bad things that do go on in all our religious traditions, because none of our religions live up to their ideals. And many people can't see beyond the bad practice of bad religion to what it is that religion is meant to point towards, and so sometimes can't see what the finger is pointing towards in their inherited tradition, but can only see it when it's illuminated from a different angle or a different perspective. But how do we handle that? How is it possible, again, in a world which isn't only about two people meeting respectfully in a room and sharing with one another at a deep level and affirming one another's freedom and then seeing, in a sense, what that leads to, but is a world in which there are all kinds of other power influences going on that distort our relationships with one another in a human sense? How can we handle these things together? So, that's something about these four principles, where they kind of came from, out of a global Christian community, particularly minority Christians, trying to work out how they could maintain their integrity of faith as Christians, but also understand themselves and be seen by majorities in other cultures as being fully, whatever it is, fully Thai or fully Indonesian, as well as fully Christian. Similar set of issues perhaps in today's context in diaspora for Muslims in quotes the West, but another way around. That's where it came from. These were then boiled down to these very pithy statements, really. Dialogue begins, dialogue depends, dialogue makes it possible, dialogue becomes the medium of authentic witness. Language that isn't particularly Christian, though you might tell me now that it is. Maybe something that's not even particularly religious, and maybe people of no particular religion, of whom there may be some here tonight who may also say, well, yes it is, or no it isn't. What do you think? Do you think these principles have any use? Are they just vague statements? Can they help us in thinking about dialogue? Let's open it up for a bit of discussion now and see what do you think. Yeah?
The four principles there. It's the last principle I'm looking at with interest. Where you say that perhaps might be a Christian. I can't remember the exact word you used.
I wondered whether it's possible the word witness may itself have Christian overtones, but
the one that I think is Christian overtones is not the word witness, but the word authentic.
Authentic. Okay.
Yeah, because that's the word that disturbs me about the last one. The idea of the authentic witness, because it depends entirely what you mean by the definition of authentic. And I would assume that the Council of Churches who wrote this perhaps mean that the authentic witness is the witness who looks at the authenticity of the theological inferences behind Christianity, rather than the authentic witness of any other religion.
Okay. I can see why you might have picked up on that. I think the intention of that word was you might have replaced it with ethical. That was the intention of that word. So it's talking about a style of bearing witness to that which you believe. If as a community you believe you've been given, as Christians, Muslims and Jews certainly do, a revelation from God, that's something given to you in trust, and to which therefore also you have an obligation to bear witness to that. You can do that. They use the language, and remember it's just after the 60s, early 70s, authenticity was a big kind of word. They used that word, but I think what they were really trying to talk about is that there are ethical and unethical ways of going about that. And what they were wanting to say was dialogue is the mode in which it's possible, or ethically, to bear witness. That's what I think their intention was. But it's, I hear how you're responding to it.
Well, it's purely a matter of semantics, I think. The interesting part is perhaps when you were saying, if I correctly understood it when you were talking, that when perhaps someone of one faith changes to another faith,
yeah,
and is that then the result of the authentic witness? If you understand my drift.
Yes, yeah, I do understand your drift. I think the principles are, in a sense, are not saying anything about that. The principles are not seeking the end of what you call a conversion of somebody. They're rather emphasising that what's important is the bearing witness and doing that in an ethical way. And that it's not the human business to determine the outcome of that. And that when humans get too interested in the outcome of that, humans being what they are, and religious communities and groups being what they are, which is more than the religious inspiration, and is also about, start to use other things, and other factors come into play, including manipulation and so on. And that therefore what this was trying to say, in a sense, is yes, bear witness, because that's what you're called to do as a Christian. It's probably what you're called to do as a Muslim. It's what you're called to do as a Jew. You need to be faithful in doing that, but faithful in doing that means doing it ethically, which means, in a sense, having done it, that's your duty. Not manipulating or trying to force an outcome from that. Yeah.
Just following on from that point, I would have liked to have seen a principle that suggests that dialogue is valuable in itself,
Right.
and that it's an organic, natural, humanistic manifestation or necessity in itself and of itself. And I think perhaps the fact that that's lacking in there, and the fourth principle, the fact that it says, I guess what you're suggesting is that inadvertently, the meeting of people of different faith and different religion is a form of authentic witness. Whether you intend to, you might not intend to convert, certainly it's not about conversion, but you are witnessing and bearing witness of your faith. Perhaps it would have been ideal to have something about dialogue being valuable in itself and of itself, and being very organic and natural, and the purpose of creation, God engaging in dialogue with his creation, at least as we understand it, and people engaging in dialogue with each other.
I understand that point. I think there's something in it. I think that probably something in this territory, in other words, this is not dialogue as a project. It's not expressing you go about the dialogue as a project to meet people, but it actually is dialogue begins when you meet, and that meeting, in a sense, is going on, in that sense, all the time. There is then a further question how you meet and what you do with it, in a sense. But certainly some of the, although they're not enormous booklets, some of the text around the principles kind of starts off saying, and particularly about neighbours who live on the street and might call into each other at a time of festival, or if somebody's died, they will go and say that they're offering a prayer, and there's the dialogue of life, I think sometimes they call it in some of the documents, and that's part of, if you like, the normality of things. And I think that is intended to lie behind this. But it's not a project about dialogue begins when people meet each other.
I mean, I think, it's hugely admirable that they produced this when they have,
Yeah.
and we're obviously looking back on it on hindsight and now providing some critique.
Absolutely.
But these concepts evolve in time, and certainly in the Muslim world, the idea is, well, what is dialogue for? I mean,
Yes.
so much of this argument and debate continues. The other point that very briefly, I was wondering whether dialogue depends on the second point, upon mutual understanding and mutual trust. Whether, personally, I would have preferred maybe dialogue depends upon mutual sincerity.
Right.
I would have thought maybe
Yeah.
the sincerity of intention in engaging in dialogue is hugely important, because you might not, I mean, it's certainly the objective of dialogue is to arrive at a mutual understanding and perhaps to arrive at mutual trust. But this is an ongoing process, and you might not have that at the beginning or even midway.
Yeah.
But certainly what's required is that it depends on your sincerity at arriving at those two endpoints.
Yeah, well. Yeah.
I think will it not suffice to say that all these principles, all these four, they are the essence of civil society, in the sense that there could never be any dialogue without meeting people. And I remember the wartime prime minister who said, George better than war.
Yes.
And in actual fact, he was not talking of religion.
No.
So he was talking of a civil order. And dialogue is essential. And those principles, I think, they justify the need for it. And whether the end result of it or whatever we think about it, I think all those understanding, meeting, and then service to humanity, without discussing what their needs are, you can never know what they want. So dialogue is quite essential. And the authenticity of it, of course, is the way you view it.
Yeah.
And your view is authentic, mine is authentic, and they might be different. So I think so far as the principles go, I think they're okay. They're acceptable for one another. Civil society, things like that.
Right. Okay. Well, that's, yeah, and I mean, one could say, well, actually, in one sense, they're highly obvious, and why make a fuss about principles of dialogue? But then also you have to take a step back and think, okay, well, for the majority Christian community in this country, many people have not had experience of people of other faiths. And what they thought they knew about them, they read about them in books, or saw on television, or heard from somebody else, travellers' stories, or whatever. So, in a sense, although these principles are it could be seen as very ordinary, their very ordinariness was actually a challenge to a way of framing things, which is that, oh yes, we know because we heard the travellers' stories of so-and-so, or yes, we read about that or heard about that in the newspapers or whatever. And what it's trying to do, go back to the name of that committee that was set up by the British Council of Churches, Committee for Relations with People of Other Faiths. So it was about kind of shifting the way, the starting point, that certainly majority Christians were probably holding at this period, not having so many opportunities, historically perhaps, for learning in terms of religious diversity, as in some societies in the world, where religious diversity had been perhaps more part of the everydayness of things. So yes, in a way, yeah, ordinary principles, but were they trying to be a corrective also to a certain way of framing and thinking about things? Yeah.
It just reminds me of this book that I read by John Nurser, entitled For All People and All Nations. And there John looks at how the Christian lobby, the World Church Council, had lobbied the San Francisco Conference, and indeed before then, the efforts which eventually resulted in the culmination of the United Nations. And they had been lobbying for freedom of religion and belief and human rights. But the idea was, as missionaries, we have, in order to preach our faith, we need freedom of religion and belief. And for that we need human rights. But it quickly became obvious that it wouldn't pass and it wouldn't gain support unless this was extended for all people and all nations, hence the title of the book. And so the church became aware that, well, these are rights that all people should have. And the argument within the church changed, and so they lobbied on those grounds and eventually were successful. And much of the human rights and freedom of religion that comes from the United Nations is accredited quite rightly to that group, to that lobby. So I mean, I see that it's interesting in terms of the history and how the argument within the church and the thought process has changed. I think this is hugely relevant to show that you have this change, because you said that those who drafted this or were instrumental in it were missionaries, and these are people. So it shows how that's a work in progress and how their thought process is changing from conversion to dialogue. And then for that reason, I think, in addition for others, this is quite significant.
Yeah, and in raising that around human rights, it does touch on another sort of slight angle here, which I'll put something up in a few moments, which is a reflection on this from another perspective, because sometimes I've felt a little troubled about these four principles by this word instead of, for example, a medium of authentic witness. The. Now, is that implying, or isn't it implying, that actually, and here's a big question, is dialogue the only way, should it be the only way, in all circumstances, in all contexts? And if so, what do you mean by it? Does it mean the toleration of injustice? Just let me put up a reflection on this from got really here. There. Oops. No. Really hypersensitive. This was a reflection on it from pre-end of apartheid South Africa, and this talk about dialogue in the Christian churches. We must not idolise dialogue as the be-all and end-all of authentic Christian existence in the world. We should have learned from the lives and integrity of faith of Christians such as those struggling against the evils of apartheid in South Africa or poverty in Central America. In such situations, dialogue alone is not enough, and it could sometimes even be a betrayal and a capitulation to evil. So, can dialogue become a comfort language about a comfort zone? And or, precisely, is dialogue absolutely critical in conflictual situations of deep structural conflict? But if so, what does it really mean at its depth, and what is the challenge that's involved in it? Because it isn't just about sitting down and being nice to each other, crudely. Is dialogue also about the speaking of truth, which can be hard? You know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa, was that about speaking things that are hard? Although it was in a framework, in the sense of dialogical framework, but it was about confronting things, not just politeness. And sometimes when we think dialogue or talk dialogue in a religious setting, I think there can be a danger of kind of not being challenged by this kind of reflection on it, or not going deeply enough with what dialogue might be about, or using it as an avoidance of something else. Question mark.
I don't think dialogue is relevant there in terms of apartheid. If we go back to that regime, Pete Botha and people like that in South Africa, there was no dialogue with them. They were purely a one-faction state. They were racist white. They would talk to nobody. And even white South Africans weren't particularly keen about other whites who didn't share their own ideas. So, I mean, to talk about dialogue having any effect on these people really is quite irrelevant. I think at the end of the day, apartheid collapsed because of tremendous pressure, economic and otherwise, from the international community, and probably from some of the violence of the black movements in South Africa. There were some great guys there, you know, Desmond Tutu and Bosak, the other guy. You don't hear much about him, but these were great guys in that movement. But the reality is, I don't think there was such a thing as dialogue, because the white regime there, the apartheid regime, didn't tolerate dialogue. There was no way a black African could talk to them.
And if we go on the basis of the principles that you've suggested, then it's not dialogue, because the second principle says that dialogue depends upon a mutual understanding.
So if trust, if there's no condition of minimal trust or understanding.
Well, there is a mutual interest to some extent, because if you go back to the time of the missile crisis between the Soviets and the Americans, there was dialogue there, but the dialogue wasn't one of mutual trust and interest, it was one of mutual preservation.
True.
I think we've got to be very careful about the choice and use of words. If we say there were no mutual trust and things like that, there was mutual trust. There was the trust on both sides that if we do this, we will get this. Yeah. If we pressurize America, they will do that. If we pressurize the USSR, they will do this. Yeah. Because the history of dialogue itself, if one looks back, especially those that have been victims of injustice, internationally, one will find that dialogue is quite essential. However, might not be very truthful on parts of people who portray themselves as people who are engendering or initiating the dialogue. Right. They might, in a sense, be protecting or trying to
protect an interest.
Their own interest. Because I remember the colonial days in Black Africa. Yes. Right from the word go, dialogues were there. Yes. I know there was an African empire as far back as the 13th century, exchanging envoys with the court of Spain, the court of Portugal. When Britain didn't know where to send their own envoys. However, when dialogue started, everything changed. So, dialogue was there, it was okay, raise awareness, and then of course...
But maybe not enough. That's not the be-all and end-all.
That's it.
Not something to idolize.
Oh yes. Yeah. And then we can see now in the Middle East, how many dialogues have you been getting? There have been dialogues forever and never. There are no sincerity, nothing.
I wonder whether, therefore, is there a distinction between dialogue and diplomacy? and whether, because diplomacy is negotiation,
Yes.
and negotiation, I wonder, is somewhat different to dialogue, because in negotiation you don't disclose the bottom line, you don't be reasonable. You're taught this, at least at the bar. You're not supposed to be reasonable. There's no such thing as being reasonable. You push for as much as you can get. You expect the other party to push for as much as he or she can get, and whatever you end up getting then becomes the norm and that which is reasonable. So negotiation, which I guess is a form of diplomacy, or diplomacy is a form of negotiation, is that not something different to dialogue? I mean, certainly in the way in which you put it up there.
Yes, I think that's an interesting reflection, because I think sometimes dialogue, in the sense, perhaps it isn't very diplomatic. It's, as I say, maybe sometimes when used properly, dialogue can be a mechanism for saying and communicating unpalatable things. And doing so directly, in a way where there's the condition that you actually can sit and speak. Of course, there are some contexts where you can't get near that. I mean, literally, physically, you can't, because you're shot before you get there. But where it's possible, perhaps there is a role for a dialogue that actually is about confronting, as well as, in that sense, about not so much about listening, but a means for speaking. There's a phrase sometimes used in some aspects of Christian social theology called speaking truth to power, which is, I think, a very interesting phrase. Because sometimes, we speak politeness to power, diplomacy to power. We need to find our way around power because power impacts on all our lives. But sometimes do we need, as individuals and as groups, to speak truth to power, where we've got the possibility of doing it, where power isn't so naked that we have no opportunity. But in many societies there is some space for opportunity to speak truth to power, but sometimes religious people, as others, don't take those opportunities and hide more behind self-interest and self-preservation than speaking truth to power. And maybe that's as much dialogue, if one could do that. Anyway. I'm not sure what time we're aiming to finish, or whether it's kind of right to wrap up about now formally, because I think there's some.
I was just thinking something very interesting there. I can't remember his name. I think it's Docking, that atheist professor who wrote this book about God. I can't remember. I saw the book today. I can't remember.
The God Delusion.
The God Delusion. That's the guy. Yeah. He seems to be very, very fixed in his opinions on these things. And I wonder if a person like him, if one could ever have dialogue with him, if his crowd ever found their way into power. Very interesting thought.
Yes. I don't know. It is, I think, possible for religious people to have dialogue with ideologically non-religious. Precisely these guidelines, as I said, were developed guidelines for people of other living faiths and ideologies. And Christians in the German Democratic Republic and the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in a sense, tried to work with these principles in those contexts where there was an ideological Marxism-Leninism that was also, in some of those countries, anti-religious in tone as well as only non-religious. And in Latin America, some Christians tried to work in a very different context where, in a kind of a liberation theology, struggle against injustice together, not with Marxists who were in power in a Marxist-Leninist sense, but Marxists who had a vision for a just society, and Christians found a way, in the Nicaraguan revolution, the poet priests and others, working in a sense dialogically with those who maybe have an ideological different position. So I think it is possible Dawkins, I'm not sure about Dawkins. I'm not so into.
So I just find it very, oh, how can I say it? I can't remember the word, but you know, he seems like a man that is not likely to be in any way sympathetic to any religious ideas. You know, I've been
It takes place in a lot of debates.
Yeah, well, I've listened to
and
him in debates.
Debate, of course, and dialogue are not the same. Like diplomacy and dialogue are not the same. But yes, it takes place in a lot of public debates. Anyhow, I hope that's perhaps given some insight into some principles which have been very widely disseminated in the Christian community. They haven't just sat within the pages of a book. When I used to work in local churches in Ashton-under-Lyne, Duckinfield, and places like that in Greater Manchester, our local council of churches looked at these guidelines on dialogue and said, what does this mean for us as Christians alongside the Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs in our neighbourhood? Does it mean something to us? Does it challenge us in any way? Are there things in here that we don't think are right? And it helped provoke a whole process that, again, kind of Latin American thinkers in education and Latin American liberation theologians call conscientization, a very complicated long word that you can hardly get out of your mouth, but engaging with issues in a way that promotes change. And I think, in a way, the four principles, as they were back up here, they're not overly complicated. It wasn't like writing a systematic theology treatise on something and saying to ordinary Christian people, here, do something with that. Here were four principles that were identified, that came out of, as I say, the two-thirds Christian world presence, often minority Christian presence, taken up here in this context, used. And sometimes it is, people of other faiths or no faith have said, oh yeah, well, we can recognise something in that too. Sometimes they pose questions and maybe it would be better to focus on sincerity or other contributions that we've had here. But, it's one contribution. So I hope it's at least sort of opened up some of where that came from, and in thinking about the four principles has perhaps also maybe given you, whoever you are, whatever you believe or don't believe or understand yourself to be religiously or not, something to challenge yourself as well about that in relation to how we relate to people of other faiths and ideologies. The Committee for Relations with People of Other Faiths. Thanks.
Thank you.